Here we are again, getting started a little late, but we want to welcome all of you to this service this evening. Also, Eunice Smith, we owe a lot of tribute to her for pulling the stories together for this meeting this evening. And she's the one going to do most of the storytelling. Sam Shank is not able to be here. He has some stories. But as Eunice is sharing some of her pieces, there may be others of you that will, the story she has will trigger some of your memories. Feel free to raise your hand or somehow make yourself known and share those pieces as well. I don't know if we'll get through all of them or not. My guess is not, but we'll go for an hour at least and see how everybody is feeling on their feet by that time. The markers, such as this one right here, were just put in this last week. This was a marker to mark actually would have been the second building of the Trissels Mennonite Church, and that walkway right there is where folks came in through that gate and into the building that was here at that time. Now, how many of you remember that old building? Quite a few of you. Okay. Well, thanks to our legal trustees for getting those markers in and up and running. So we're grateful for that. I wanted to say, I believe I did say thanks to Don for setting up the sound. Thanks to Eunice for working on this, and thanks to Dan Showalter. Eunice did a number of interviews with Dan to get some stories. Some others she got from Charles Haldeman down here, and some from the rest of you who sent her stories or pieces to share. So let's have prayer, and then we're going to turn our time over to Eunice. Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for persons in this cemetery who have gone before us, stories of faith, faithfulness, and we pray that as we hear not only faith stories this evening, but just events of these persons' lives, that somehow our own lives would be enriched and encouraged. So guide us for your name's sake. Through Christ we pray. Amen. Okay, Eunice.
First part of this evening, I wanted to talk about the memories that people have of the second Trissels Church, the 1900 church. It's been exactly 100 years. It's been 100 years since that church was built. It served our congregation for 50 years, and I wanted to start with our memories of that congregation and that building structure. And I talked to Dan Showalter about that, and I'd like to share with you the stories that he gave me of his memories, and then open it to anybody here who would like to share any of their memories about that church. Listen to the memories that Dan Showalter has of the 1900 Trissels Church. I love to go there. I love to go there better than Zion. It was there in the woods, and a number of community people came there that I knew. My 5th grade teacher, Lillian Pennington, came here. Cedar Run had their church service 1 hour earlier because a lot of the people wanted to come to Trissels for the preaching. We didn't know who was going to preach. The preachers used a calendar. Each church had services on its scheduled Sunday. Some weeks the preachers of Northern District were scheduled to go into the mountains. When the preachers were appointed to come to Trissels, they would come. The members didn't know who was going to preach, but the preachers did. When it came to go into the mountains, it seemed like Perry Shank, Sam Shank's father, and my father, Tim Showalter, had more turns than anyone else did. What did the 1900 building look like? It was a white church. There was a walk that went into it, and it had a step or two. The church had 2 doors, one for the women and one for the men. And down the middle of the room ran a divider that separated the men from the women. It wasn't a wall. It was a wooden divider that you could just see the heads of the people over. The reason they had that partition was so that when we had communion, the women wouldn't get embarrassed when we washed our feet. We did not sit in families. The women went in the right door and the men used the left. The real little children sat with their mothers. When they got bigger, they would sit in the back with their friends. The boys and girls did not mix. The men's side had 2 rows of pews, and the women's side had the same thing. The boys liked to sit in the back corner where they couldn't be watched. They liked to catch flies and talk. About the time they added a balcony, they took the partition out, and the families started to sit together. Behavior was so much better. In the front, they had the Amen corner. Usually the older men sat in that. And on the opposite side, they had a place where the older women and the preacher's wives sat. Having spittoons in the church was before my time, but behind the stove there was a short bench, where when old men came from other churches like Cedar Run, there was a sawdust box to use for spitting their tobacco behind the stove. There were 2 stoves. One was on the men's side, and one was on the ladies' side. The stove was a beautiful stove. It was cast iron and had a girl holding a basket of fruit on the front. Boy, if the service was long, looking at that basket of fruit about made me starve. Howard Showalter supplied wood for the stoves. Then Trissels had a wood furnace put into it. They did not use wood from the trees around the church unless the tree was dying or was one that was going to give trouble. The trees are pretty much like they are now, just bigger. The trees in the buggy days were used to hitch the reins of the buggies. They would come in and hang the rein on a horseshoe nailed to the tree. They would be there until they came out, and then they would unrein the horse and back the buggy up and be on their way. Unless there was something special planned, when I was a boy, about 80 to 100 people came to Trissels. The horses weren't much in my time. I remember more about cars, but I do have memories of the horses. My father, Timothy Showalter, and Wilmer Guile were the last to get cars. Howard Showalter, or HDH, had a big family. He was the father of Carl, Owen, Howard DeWitt, Jim, Doris Trumbo, Catherine Shank, Mary Emma Edie, Ethel Strike, and Maisie's husband, Jake. He had a big Lincoln car. I was about 6 or 7 when my dad got a car. I was born in 1916, so that was about 1922 or 23. The pulpit was on the east end. One preacher would preach, but if there was a couple other preachers there, they would sit up there too. The length of the sermon depended on who was preaching. When the preaching was done, the other preachers would get up and say, "I bear testimony what the brother has said." If he was impressed about something, he might talk about it. There was quite a bit of singing. On the 4th Sunday night, Trissels had a singing. They called on different ones to lead songs. Someone would lead a song, and then they would appoint Brother So-and-so to lead. If someone wearing a necktie led the singing, none of the Giles would sing. They would always ask my father to sing Rise, Glorious Conqueror. My sisters at my father's funeral used that song. People liked to hear him lead that song. He would really put the power behind it with his good bass voice. Eddie Guile liked to lead songs real slow. Often he would say, "Slower, please." Women never led singing. They did not say anything. They were quiet. They did teach children in Sunday school. No woman taught a men's class. That was taboo. I didn't have a favorite preacher. Everybody liked Hop Turner. They liked Abram Heichman and Louis Shank. He often was a little bit long, but no one cared because he was so interesting. He would shut his eyes when he preached. Perry Shank would also shut his eyes when he preached. In 1950, they decided to build a new church. They needed a bigger church. When they moved some of the district events from one church to the other, they never let Trissels have a turn because they didn't have room. There was no place to serve the meals. Trissels decided they didn't want to be left out of things, so they decided to build bigger. Some people threw a big objection to it. Lindale had 2 communions. Brenneman's no longer existed, but Lindale had a communion to celebrate Brenneman's, and then they had one to celebrate Lindale. Communion was open to other churches. Often when Zion had their communion, Trissels people went to Zion. There were a lot of Shanks and Showalters also at Zion. The Howard Showalter family came to Trissels, and the George Showalter family went to Zion. There was not a lot of competition between the churches. They were considered one congregation. I remember the young people of Zion and Trissels disliked the 5th Sunday meeting at Lindale. This was before Trissels got their own Sunday meeting. The young people had a meeting. They got up and raised Cain and made their speeches. Some of the young people would have been Perry Shank's children and Tim Showalter's children. I have a lot of memories of Trissels Church and many of the people who are buried here. In the graveyard are many who attended Trissels, but also there are many people from Brock's Gap and Cedar Run. Many of the smaller churches did not have cemeteries, so Trissels was used. A grave lot did not cost anything, so people who did not have a church would use Trissels. Trissels Cemetery was one of the earliest cemeteries in the area. Does anyone else here want to share any of their memories that they have of the Trissels 1900 church?
We might share that the sexton that took care of the church and the cemetery, faithful old man, Preston Brown.
Well, we're going to visit his grave. A lot of people remember Preston. Yeah. Any other memories of Trissels when it lived here 100 years ago?
I remember the little cherry trees down here along the fence. And we youngsters would go out there and eat cherries every Sunday. We started before they were real ripe.
My plan for this evening is to kind of move through the cemetery in this direction, come swing around the back, and come around that end of it, kind of make a circle. And we're going to end up over here in the more recent part where a lot of people have memories of family or church members that are more in this generation or related to us. So that's what I'm going to ask you to do, is move with me in this direction. And I've kind of got some flags marked where places that I want to stop. And if you have someone that I've missed that you know something about, please stop us and share your story or add to anything I have to say. I appreciate it greatly. Claude Jr. and his wife. They were bricklayers and stonemasons. Claude Bodkin and Claude Bodkin Jr. were bricklayers and stonemasons, and they were very impressed with Trissels, and they desired to be buried here. Charlie Hoffman shared that when the 1950s church was built, Claude and Claude Jr. did the brickwork. They didn't have a way to lift the heavy stuff up with a hydraulic lift like we do today, so they built a runway that went way down into the woods here, and they'd wheel the bricks in the mortar up this runway to get to the top of the building to get the bricks up there. Charlie remembered that George Dove tore down this frame church and built a house for his son with the materials. He said that George Dove lived up on the hill where the monument is to mark where John Klein is dead. Charlie Brown, where John Klein died. Charlie Hoffman doesn't know where that house built from the church is, and I'd sure be interested if anybody has that knowledge. He said the frame church was in awful good shape when they took it down piece by piece, that it was a solid building still in the 1950s.
The building's up close to McMullen Funeral Home in that area.
Okay. You say the building's up close to McMullen
It's up
Funeral
here,
Home?
close in that area.
Do you know who owns it now?
I'm not sure. I think it's one of George Dove's relatives.
So they still have it in their family?
I think. I'm not positive of that.
Okay. That's real interesting to know. I wondered where the wood has got to.
The little white house is built out of it.
Little White House.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? You remember Claude Bodkin? The information I have today comes from a lot of sources. From Henry Brunk's book and from Charles Nair's History of Cedar Run. He wrote that in 1948. Dan Showalter shared that Mr. Nair would come in and plow for people in the Cedar Run area, and while he rested his horses, he would ask them about the history of their farm and their family. And we've discovered that many of the early landowners of Cedar Run are buried here at Trissels. Some of the graves are unmarked, and some of them are buried alone without family. Some of the locations are no longer known. And these Cedar Run landowners buried at Trissels include the names Christian Van Trump, Andrew Kessaker, Americus V. Bull, Reuben Runyon and his wife Frances, who was a daughter of Joseph Trissels, John Mason, his wife Mary and son Moses, Henry Whistler, who was a shoemaker, and his wife Matilda are buried here, Cambius Whistler, son of Henry, who was also a shoemaker, and interestingly, he married a Martha shoemaker, a daughter of Levi shoemaker. They are all buried here at Trissels and mentioned in the Nair book. Right up here at this tombstone, Noah and Susan Heiser these were the grandparents of C.E. Nair, who wrote the history of Cedar Run, and he also wrote the history of the Linville Creek area. Daly, and this is a Sam Shanks story, so I'm sorry Sam's not here to hear it. But he said Daly used to tease Sam Shank about wearing shoes big enough for turkeys to make nests in. So, on a trip to Canada one year, Sam decided to send Daly a package, collect. And after Daly paid for it and he opened it, he found a pair of Sam's oldest shoes in it. Annie Parks, Daly's wife, is the oldest daughter of Mary Dare Turner and Carl Falk's great aunt. So, and that's a Sam Shank story for you. We have a lot of M. Swallers buried here at Trissels. Dewey M. Swaller was a minister at Bethel Church. Cleta, his wife, was a sister to Nellie Guthrie. And I think we have B. Frank M. Swaller right up here, who's a father to Ray and Dewey, buried right here beside the Heidegger. So there's a lot of M. Swallers, and I'm sure a lot of you probably have some memories of the M. Swaller family. A lot of Turners in this church and they're fascinating to talk about. And I'm sure a lot of you have information about the Turners. We have Adam and Mary Turner, and the answer to one of my questions this morning about the bear is Adam Turner. He is mentioned in John Whalen's A History of Virginia for Boys and Girls. And in there it says that he killed a total of 154 bears. That he killed his first one in 1872 at the age of 13, and the most he killed in 1 year was 17. Gloria Swope's father guesses that total kill is a little high. He taught school. He was a supervisor of the school district. He was involved in politics. Whalen says that he is responsible for bringing the Virginia white-tailed deer back to Rockingham County. And his daughter Hallie Clutter, right here, carried the mail on horseback. And we also have Alice Dare Turner and John Falk buried just up a little bit here in the cemetery, and we'll talk about them just a little bit later. Alice Dare was his daughter, and she and John Falk were Homer Falk's grandparents, Carl's parents. So we have Adam, who was an uncle of Ben Turner. I think we've got Ben here somewhere. Let's see, Benjamin's right here. Virginia Martin shares the story. She said that her father's land and Benjamin Turner's land met together right on the top where John C. Myers Elementary School is right now. And she visited and played and went there many times. And Benjamin had a litter of pigs, and one of the Sal's would nurse. And so she got one of the little pigs, and she named it Susan, after Susan Turner, Ben's wife. So she was sharing that story with me. Eunice? Yes. Yes.
Adam Turner.
Adam Turner. Tell me about Adam Turner.
I think he surveyed the lot for my first home. And his instrument didn't have a compass in it, but he could sight it. It did have a compass for north and south, but it wasn't magnified. And he did very accurate work in spite of the antiquity of the instruments he used. And anywhere you went with one of his deeds, it was accepted very readily.
He has a lot of family buried here.
He was the brother to Gloria's grandfather.
Right, Gloria.
Zach was also a surveyor.
Okay, let's get this
No,
one.
I'm wrong. It was Zach.
It was Zach. Zach was the one who did
Zach was
Zach.
the
older Zach.
And her Uncle Adam carried the chain for Uncle Zachy's daddy to do a lot of surveying on the mountain. There was a story he told many times that the government surveyors were in and couldn't get a track to come out up here in the mountain. And together in one day they started and made a circle and came back exactly where they started and had it all figured out.
Is Zach buried here then?
No, they're buried in Mountain Grove. Zach is.
We were at that funeral. This is Hop's.
Brother?
No, Hop
That was
Turner
their brother
here.
to Zach.
Okay. And this is a daughter. Katie Turner is a daughter to Adam Turner. She taught school, I know that. And Frank was a son of Hop Turner.
Yeah, well, Kate was.
Kate was a daughter of Hop Turner. Oh, I thought she was Adam Turner's.
Frank and her sister. Yeah,
Okay, well, I learned something new. I always learn something new when I
Add
talk to
that to your
people.
page.
Yeah, okay.
Is Frank Turner the one that went to our church?
Yes, this is our Frank Turner right here. Yeah.
December the 12th, 97.
7, This is our Frank.
And where's Zach Turner's grave?
His is right in the newer part, beside his second wife. Yeah, we'll probably see that when we come around. Okay. Any more Turner stories? Okay, let's walk on down this way. This is the tombstone of Samuel O. Smith. And Samuel O. Smith has 3 wives buried here at Trissels. Mary, his first wife, died when she was 17. And Beulah, his another wife, died when she was 23. And Sarah died at the age of 31. I think this is Mary, the first wife. And then the other 2 are mentioned here on the tombstone with him. There are some unmarked graves here for 2 Smith infants, which made me wonder if some of the wives might not have died in childbirth. But Samuel Smith married again, and he and his 4th wife, Lula, lived back over the hill from Dan Showalter, and Dan remembers him well. He ran a little store, and they had a crippled son, Clyde Smith, who's also buried here at Trissels. Let's go. Let's see. I wanted to find Cora Mason. I think she's right on. Daughter of George Mason. And Dan called her his granny woman. Anybody know what a granny woman is? Granny woman came into your home when you had a mother had a child, and she helped the new mother. And Cora Mason was Dan's granny woman. She also ran a bakery in Broadway. It was located right beside the Ace Hardware store today. When I was a little girl, that was a candy store run by Rube Dove. My father, John Guile, remembers that his grandfather, Joseph Guile, had bread delivered from her bakery daily to their home. She moved to Harrisonburg later in life, and she baked pies for the college and for the MC. And she's buried here at Trissels with a lot of other Masons. I think we have about 35 Masons buried here. Okay?
I suppose Cora Mason brought me to Trissels as a young boy oftener than most any other person other than my family. She had an old Model T car, and she would always want to be sure I had a way to Trissels. And it was an open car. And then at the bakery, if there was anything I had to sell or my mother had to sell, or if I had made something out of wood and wanted to sell it, she'd sell it for me at the bakery. She was a kind old lady.
I understand she also had somebody who roasted peanuts and sold peanuts out of her store.
Hump Turner.
Hump Turner. Virginia Martin was telling me about Hump Turner.
He had trouble with alcohol, but she tried to help him. She really tried to help him.
Cora taught my Sunday school class. She didn't like it down in the auditorium where there was one class after another, so she took us up in the pulpit, and she expected us to watch her rather than what was going on out there. But she made us memorize an awful lot of scripture. I memorized more scripture under her than ever in my life.
She left a lot of money to the general mission.
She donated a lot of
She
money.
lived frugally, but she left a lot of money.
I know she never married.
She never married.
Do you have any explanation why these graves are running facing east? And now they're up.
You know why? When the judgment day comes, they'll rise in the east. That's why they always built there.
Oh, you
They
think?
face in the east. That's what they say.
But he's wondering why the new ones then are going the other way.
I guess they don't believe that anymore. I have no idea. What do you think?
I'm not sure they're not.
You might have the answer. I don't know.
I believe they're more east than these are, really.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't know my directions anymore. But that was only the explanation I'd heard.
I thought it was perhaps how the building was set.
So let's come back here further toward the glass, and John Montgomery Glass and Emma Spencer Glass. They are not Mennonites. John Montgomery Glass gave land for what was called Glass Church near Coots's store. And in 1991, it had a sign that had a faded sign on it that said Bethany and seemed unused. We got a letter from it's a letter from Virginia Glass Slabaugh, and these are her maternal great-great-grandmother and great-grandparents. And she donated funds for Grace Showalter's memorial. And she wrote a letter, and she talked about her grandparents. And she said that her father came into the Mennonite faith by marrying a Mennonite. His family moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania from Virginia when he was a boy. A Mennonite family named Turner bought the farm near Coots's store from my grandfather, Frederick Glass. I understand that the two families lived in the same house temporarily, the Turners and the Glasses. I'm not sure if that would have been Neil Turner's farm. I'm not sure. But they shared the house briefly before the Glasses moved out. And I wanted to mention the Glass family in our walk tonight. We have two tombstones here in German. Christian Funk and his wife, Susanna Funk. She was a Giles, so she's my one relative here in the cemetery. Christian Funk owned land at the mouth of Cedar Run. He was a farmer and a tombstone cutter who also made sickles. There are 5 of their infants buried here at Trissels. It is said that he collapsed when leaving singing at Trissels and never made it home. It's the story in the Bronx book. And his tombstone is in German. Right beside us here are the Trissel graves. The Trissel family owned this land originally, they say, and our church takes its name from the Trissels. Barbara Trissel's grave is one of the earliest here at Trissels, according to Nair. And they have recently put a new tombstone in for the children of Joseph and Rebecca Paul Trissel. And the interesting thing about these tombstones are that the children all died within a very short time of each other. November of 1862, November 19th of 1862, November 27th of 1862, December 17th of 1862, and then January 24th of 1863. And I have no idea.
Was that the time of the Great Flu epidemic?
Well, there was a Great Flu epidemic in 1918 that I know about, but this is during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Is this part of the Trissel's name? Is that church name? I mean,
The family, yeah, that same family, a little later generation. You'll find in this cemetery there's a lot of unmarked graves, and many of them are children or infants that never survived. It was a very rough, difficult time for children and for women of bearing children. Many didn't survive, and I was amazed in the cemetery how many children's graves we have here. Church. Tradition says that Trissels dates from 1822. For the sum of $15, Abraham Neff and his wife Catherine sold 1 acre of land, including a graveyard. And the graveyard was already in existence when the acre of land was sold to the said fraternity of the Meadows Church on 31st of May, 1823. According to the Bronx book, I believe. No, I'm sorry, this is Mayor. It says the church was located in the southwest corner of the lot. A lane passed between the land lying to the west and the church with the graveyard. Horses were hitched to the east and the north of the church. Timothy Showalter, Dan's father, removed the first board when they tore down the first church. Most of the materials were sold at auction. but they used the foundation stones for the second church built in 1900. While construction went on, Trissels' regular first Sunday of the month meeting was held at Cedar Run Church of the Brethren. Here is where we're estimating that the location for the first Trissels church was. Yeah. Trissels, this building was 20 by 25 feet long. It was a log structure. It was enlarged in 1850 to about 30 by 40. And then in 1900, the second church was built, and they totally moved the location from this land. In fact, this piece of land was traded away in exchange for land on that side of the cemetery. We bought this back recently, and this is our most recent cemetery. Yeah, this is a really interesting section of cemetery. We have an unmarked grave here that I'd like to talk about first. I got this information from the Isaac Ritchie book of Virginia. We have buried at Trissels a Solomon Ritchie. His grave is not marked, but according to the Ritchie book, he's buried at Trissels, and this is the plot for Solomon Ritchie. During the Civil War, a bullet struck his belt buckle, whirled him around, and it saved him from being killed. So I found that very interesting about Solomon Ritchie. The rest of this tombstone that's enclosed in concrete is the Brown Cemetery. James and Phoebe Brown and their family were early landowners here in this area in Cedar Run, and they're in the Nair book. James's grandson Preston, and this is Preston's stone right here, was the sexton for the church for many years. He made the fire, and his mother would help him clean the church. He never married. Charles Halterman remembers coming to the church with Preston when he came to tend the church. Preston worked for Mr. Milton Halterman, Charlie's dad, right down over the hill here, and lived beside their farm. He recalls that Preston would fill 2 large sacks of leaves from the trees. He would tie the end together and carry them home, one hanging down the front and the other slung over his back, and he used them for bedding his few cows. He did not drive a car. He always walked up here to the church. Another story was shared with me that he would bring 2 other young boys named Forrest and Pasco Rader to the church to help rake leaves. Occasionally he would become afflicted with a jumping headache, and he would have to go lie down on the church benches, leaving the boys to rake the leaves. He was the sexton for the church for many, many years, and is remembered by a lot of people here.
First big one.
Right here, J. Preston Brown. This is all family here. Let's see. Catherine, did you have anything special else you wanted to say about J. Preston? No, just remembered him. Bernice remembered when he got sick toward the end, and they would have to bring meals in to help him.
I can remember Preston Brown quite well. He always wore a pretty well trimmed mustache, and Cora Mason would give him a ride when there was weather was bad, and I was riding with Cora Mason at that time, and he lived down the road here a short way.
They say he did get married, Eunice.
He married Fanny Mason.
Well, according to Charlie, he just went in and helped to take care of her toward the end. They were married.
Roy Mason was very much instrumental in that.
Okay.
Cora.
Roy married because Fanny was his relative.
Well, I was under the impression that he never married, so I learned something new. Yeah. We have a relation to the Brown family in this row of tombstones right here. the daughter, Kate or Mary Catherine Brown, married a Henry H. Showalter. And he was a Confederate soldier. It was said that when he was shot through the lung, the doctor was able to draw a handkerchief through the path of the bullet, and his breathing stopped when the wound was disinfected. He married his nurse, who was Mary Catherine Brown, and I've been told that he was known for making fine brandy. The theory has been suggested that he shot Elder John Klein, but has never been proved. He and his 2 wives, and I think we have some children here, are buried near the Brown family, which is Mrs. Showalter's family. One more thing before we leave J. Preston Brown. He was very instrumental in recording with J. Mark Martin the location of many of the unmarked graves here at Trissels. In his later years, he was about the only one who remembered where some of the people were buried. And he and J. Mark walked the cemetery, and he pointed out to J. Mark some of the unmarked graves. So that's how we have some of the information that we have today on places that didn't have stones, or the stones weren't legible anymore. So we have a lot to thank him for that. Our oldest tombstone in the cemetery is a relative of Henry Burkholder's. And I think Henry told me it's his great-great-great-great-grandmother. 4 greats, okay, right over here. Her name was Margaret Huber Burkholder. Her husband, Peter Burkholder Sr., was a major landowner here in the Cedar Run area. And she died in 1798. And she was buried here before Trissels Cemetery was part of Trissels Church. Her husband Peter was on a trip to Pennsylvania, and he died in Pennsylvania and was buried at Grothdale. So he's not here beside her. Oh, please do. Hold on, I'm coming.
This Peter Burkholder's father left Switzerland and started to move over here. They stopped in Germany. And there he passed away with some kind of infection, and he talks his wife into coming on and bringing the family. He was one of them. They landed in Philadelphia, of course, and settled in Pennsylvania for a while. In 1790, he brought his family up here with a wagon and moved in this house right down to Foothill.
Where the Rhodeses live now?
Right.
Jim Rhodes?
Right, and they owned all this land.
Uh-huh.
And of course, she was buried here before it was sold to the Trissels.
Okay. Great. We have kind of a mystery stone here. It's marked 1814 and just has the initials MB. And the cemetery records say possibly an Ulrich Burkholder, but we don't know for sure whose grave this is. Do you
I
know?
didn't finish to tell you about the tombstone.
Okay.
That tombstone was just absolutely not readable. And Nancy Hess came up here. I don't know how many of you know Nancy. And she located the thing. We put that stone up in 79.
1979, it says the descendants of Margaret Burr, and you helped to do that.
Well, I didn't help her. I did some money.
That's helping. Okay. Let's see. I think we're going to walk a little bit here now. Right here is the tombstone for the first Daniel Showalter. Dan Showalter, our Dan, called him the granddaddy of all the Showalters here in the valley. So he was the very first Showalter, and his wife was Margaret. So that's the first Showalter. Oh, it's on the bottom. Yeah. It's right here. Right here. And his son, or the second generation, is Joseph, and he and his wife Anna are here on the other side. And then we'll come over to the next generation. You want to talk about this?
He was the oldest that spoke German, the last preacher that spoke German here.
Huh? We got. Which is the last one to speak German? The second one? Okay. The second stone Okay, the second big tall stone is another Daniel. That's the third generation Showalter. And his name was Daniel, and he was a minister. He preached in German. And Dan, our Dan Showalter, there are Dan Showalters here, said that nobody liked to hear him preach because he preached in German. But that there were some Lutherans back in the mountain area that spoke German and just loved when he came to preach for them. He rode horseback and he would go back and preach for them.
Was it Daniel and Nancy then, the next generation?
I'm going to stop here and look at In this area right here, we have three different groups. This is Noah Spitzer and his wife, Sarah, Edgar S. Pennington and his wife, Anna, and we have Jacob Pfeiffer right here and his wife. I want to remember the wives. Francis. These three groups of families were very instrumental in building the 1900 Trissels Church. Noah Spitzer served as trustee at Trissels and was involved with land purchases for the church. He and his wife had 9 children, 7 of their sons, Jewett, Lute, Otis, Angelo, Aldine, Raleigh, and Stewart are buried here at Trissels with their families. And just as now, Trissels then was a congregation of families. And you've seen that we find many family relationships here. Edgar S. Pennington and his wife Anna sold a 3-corner strip of woodland between the graveyard and the highway for $40. Trustee at that time in 1894 was George Brunk, Jacob Pfeiffer, and Noah Spitzer. And then at one time, Edgar Pennington owned the land back here where the Barry Rhodes farm is. And he and his wife are here with their children Thomas, Ida, Klinger, William, and Alpheus. So we have a lot of Penningtons buried here. Jacob and Francis Pfeiffer owned a lot of land around here. They owned the farm down behind here, the Halterman place. They owned land here at Trissels. They gave land to Trissels, and they also sold for the sum of $20 land lying on the south side of the cemetery. The trustees for that sale were Perry Shank, Christian Brunk, and J.W. Martin. So we have these gentlemen here who are very active in our church at the beginning of the century and were instrumental in building the second Trissels Church. I've missed somewhere up here, and I'm not sure where he's located. I just wanted to mention Anthony Showalter is buried here at Trissels. I don't know if, I think he was the father for Perry Shank's wife, Katie. And I have a story about him that I wanted to share that Dan gave with me before we talk about these Showalters here.
She wanted to say where he was buried.
Anthony?
That Anthony was buried inside.
Oh, I thought he was buried here. We have an Anthony here. It's not. Anthony Showalter, who is Katie Shank's father, was known for being tight. The story is told that one day he was taking apples to Broadway for sale. His boys traded the apples and kept the best ones for the family at home without him knowing. So that was a joke they played on their father. He built the house that my parents, John and Kathleen Guy, live in now. Okay. Daniel Showalter and Mary J. Showalter. This story comes from Jim Showalter. If I don't get this right, you're going to have to help me with it, okay? Daniel, father to H.D.H., had a brother named Michael who joined the Southern Army, but Daniel did not. In an attempt to escape punishment for not joining, he attempted to travel to Ohio, where he would have been safe. but he was captured in Wheeling, West Virginia, and imprisoned in Libby Prison in Richmond. Conditions were terrible, with poor sanitation and starvation. His health was always poor after this time. His wife, Mary, attempted to keep the farm and family going by herself. And this is the farm where Glenn Showalter, son of Howard DeWitt, lives today. He returned home after his wife was able to raise the $350, is that the right amount, $350? Needed to buy his freedom. He died at the age of 48 because of his poor health. His father, Daniel, outlived him by 2 years and died in 1889. Check the tombstone. His son, HDH, which is buried right here, was 4 years old at the time of his father's death. HDH later bought the home place and supported his mother and crippled brother and raised a large family. Anybody else have any Daniel stories? You're smiling at me, Joyce. Got anything you want to add?
You're doing fine.
Okay. HDH. I remember HDH when I was a young girl coming to Trissels. And he spent many hours here at the church working on the upkeep of the grounds in the graveyard. And I know that the church meant a lot to him. His wife, Flossie Grove, is buried here with him. I know that he was a member of the board of directors of the Valley National Bank. He was a major farm owner here in the area and raised a lot of cattle. Had a big shipping of cattle out. Anybody want to share some stories of, because I know we've got a lot of his children and grandchildren here at this church. I remember him with white hair. He never wore a plain suit. I think Virginia Martin said he and Ben Turner were two men who never wore a plain suit. Yes, Doris.
He had a real good bass voice. He loved to sing. He often led the singing. But then in later years, I'm not sure which year it was, that he lost his voice. He had paralysis of the vocal cord, and then he couldn't sing, and he couldn't even speak well. People had problems understanding him, and that was always hard for him.
Do you want to tell how he got his name?
Yes, I'm not sure where the Howard came from, but of course the Daniel was a family name, and Hercus. I understand that Hercus was the name of a family that was visiting in the home. So he went by the name Tommy until he was 4 years old, and then the family decided it was time to name him a more proper name. So they attached the Hercus onto the Howard Daniel.
I'd heard that and I found it interesting. Yeah. Anybody else want to talk about Howard DeWitt? I'm sorry, HDH. I shouldn't say Howard DeWitt. I'll get my Howards confused. We have a Spitzer up here. I talked about Noah Spitzer as one of the trustees and his many sons. Here are several of them. We have Raleigh. Raleigh had a blacksmith shop at the end of 259, and he worked on wagon wheels and shod horses. The whole area of all the sons owned land along, a large portion of their land was owned along Heiser Lane, ending out on 259 where Raleigh had his blacksmith shop. From about the area where Ralph Showalter's farm is today on out is Spitzer land. Aldine is one of the brothers, and Lute is another. John Falk and Alice Dare Turner Falk. Alice was the daughter of Adam Turner. What I wanted to share with you about John Falk comes from Charlie Halterman. He remembers John well. He said that he is Homer, or he called him Hooker Falk's dad. He was one of the first fellows that started to raise turkey in houses. He built round houses so the turkeys wouldn't pile up in the corners. They weren't very big, just like a big silo. He had a bunch of them. After they commenced putting up regular houses and using wire around the brooder stoves to keep the birds from piling up, the roundhouse idea ended. He was the first one who had the idea to put turkeys out on the range. He built a brooder stove. Charlie Wampler took him to Washington to get a patent for it. It was a wood brooder stove that was kind of square. Mark Showalter's was round-shaped. That was your father's. Right. John Falk got tired of making them, and none of his boys were really interested in it, so they didn't make too many. He raised a lot of chickens and turkeys. His boys raised a lot of poultry. Homer still does, and John is Carl Falk's grandfather. Another one of John's boys was named Bush. His real name was Weldon. There was Scrub, or Casper, who's buried here. He ran the hatchery. And then Paul, his nickname was Poss, ran an antique place. Casper built his first hatchery next to where Poss lived, and he built another hatchery down on 613 near Neff's lumber mill, near the greenhouse down there later. Charlie Halterman said he sold eggs to him to hatch. He sold good birds. You didn't get any calls from John Falk. He took the calls out and gave them away. After that, he got into the feed business, and he was a fine man. And anybody else want to share any memories of John Falk?
He was a Republican, and he had a friend that voted Democrat. And there was one election that it might have been during Roosevelt was coming in or something, but he talked his friend into going squirrel hunting, so he dropped him off the mountains, and he snuck back off and voted, and then told him about it later. He won't cancel out his vote.
There's a lot of Falks in the cemetery here.
Usually count how much somebody gives, but we weren't expecting anything from them. And this is about 3-4 years ago.
Can't hear him.
3 or 4 years ago, we received $5,000 from the Spitzer family for upkeep here at the cemetery. We appreciate it. We knew some of them. I didn't know how many of them.
Right. Let's come down to this end of the cemetery, please. We have here, I just found out this evening, Anna Eleanor Harper, and she worked at the Broadway drugstore, I believe, for many years. She was an aunt to Sandy Lambert here at church, and Sandy's grandparents down here. Well, these are her. No, this is Georgiana, wife of Major Harper, and yeah, Ada and Heavener C, grandparents of Sandy Lambert here. So she's got family here in the cemetery. Right here is George and Rosa Mason. We talked about the Masons just a little bit. Right. I wanted to talk about this grave here. This was John Guthrie Jr., and he was 6 years old when he died. And this comes from Burness. He was up on the roof helping his father, and his dad sent him down for nails, and he fell and died. His parents were John and Nellie Guthrie, and his father's buried right here. He has a good bit of family right around him. Nellie Guthrie's sister, Tressie Nesselbroth, is right behind Ethel, right there. That's one of his sisters. And let's see, there's some other sisters. Maggie Seitz was a sister to Nellie, and she's buried here, and so is the mother of Virginia Walker.
Right here.
Right here. Yeah, I knew they were right close here. Right. And these were all family relatives. I think Ernest Alger was I think she might have been a half-sister or a relation also. So there's a lot of family members buried right here.
Back to Anna Harper.
Okay.
drank much coffee that she had perked at the drugstore. I sent a salesman down there once who was new in the area, and he also wanted to buy something from the outdoor shop that was next door to his place. The guy in the outdoor shop was rather quiet, wouldn't say much. And then when he recognized the customer and wanted to buy, he nodded and disappeared through the back door. The salesman said he never returned. I said, well, you didn't know what was behind the back door. It took him a while to find it. He said, well, I went up the street to that drugstore that you recommended, and this lady there behind the counter, I said, I'd like to have a cup of coffee, please. And she turned around and said, can't you see the pot's empty? But he said he got a good cup of coffee, and he found out later she was a kind lady.
Come on, walk this way. We have, I want to talk about George Mason.
No, I remember him, but not like some of you. How about this grave here with the Mason?
George Mason was a machinist, and he was one of the first ones that worked at Railway Metal Works.
He's the brother to Cora Mason.
He has some children buried over here. We'll see their graves. They're in the newer part of the cemetery. Raymond and they're Fats and Slim. Yeah, the newer part of the cemetery. I know it. I've seen it.
Frost.
Frost is his son-in-law, right? Furnace was
They're still living down in the corner.
right. This is Frost Falk, or he's called Pete Falk. It says he was the oldest son of George Mason, Charles Falk. I'm sorry. He was the oldest son of Charles Falk, and he was the only boy. He attended Trissels regularly. He worked for Sam Shank for many years, and Charlie Haltman said he was a real mechanic. It was high praise from him. He was a fine fellow in every respect. And his wife, Furnace, is still alive.
And she likes company.
Okay, and she likes company. We have a couple more of the sisters here, sons, Clinton and Jewett Spitzer. I'm not sure how he's... Is he a brother? Okay. I had just a little piece yet to share about an unusual family called Smoot. And they're all... Okay.
We have an old stone here. Why were they were up there and you were a part of it? They would have been on there. They was in this cemetery that ran all of them around this water.
They were in the eastern part of the cemetery.
Okay.
This is actually the first row. I call it the first row of the old cemetery.
Okay.
And this is the newest part. Reuben Smoot and his wife Dorothy were the mother and the father, and then we have their children. None of their children married. We have the last two that we have down here, Molly and Estella, and they have no dates on their tombstones. They're the only tombstone in the church with names and no dates on them. And these two ladies are remembered very well. Charlie Halterman remembers that his father Milton would haul their stuff to Harrisonburg, and they would sell chickens and cows. Whenever they sold anything, they wouldn't take a check. They always wanted cash. And if Mr. Halterman got a check for them from a sale, he'd have to go to the bank and cash it and bring it back for them. If they bought anything, they always paid cash too. Stella and Molly came to the Mennonite faith late in life through the efforts of Norman Durstein.